It is my great pleasure to have a friend of mine and soon to be a friend of all of yours, Darlene Tonelli, here to talk contract literacy. I think this is the third in the series, which I like to sort of subtitle this whole series of things I wish I knew 20 years ago. And so I think this is a great fitting end to the series. Darlene is an amazing guest. She has her own law firm, Inter Alia Law, with a great team of media, tech, and entertainment lawyers. And prior to that was VP of Business Development and Corporate Affairs at Universal Music Canada. And also the host of Lawyer Life podcast, which is fascinating, not just for lawyers. I have listened to many, many episodes, and it's wonderful. And I also just want to say, Darlene, you're such a beacon because you're somebody I know who started the firm in a time when people thought it was crazy to work from home. And now you've got the last laugh and everybody's working from home, and you've shown everyone that this is the way that you can do it and actually have work-life balance. And I'm just so happy to have you here. I think we should start off just a little bit with a little disclaimer on the legal side for you, if you want to just put that legalese into kind of colloquial speak for us.
Colloquial speak. Okay. Hi, everyone. Nice to see. Well, we can see the list of panelists. So I think I've got a good sense of who's here. Some of you I know, which is fun. The disclaimer is just that this is legal information, and we always give that disclaimer. But I like to say the reason for the disclaimer is not just for fun, because lawyers like disclaimers, but because it's not specific to anyone's facts. So if there's often when we do these webinars, we get very specific questions. So those we wouldn't answer, but we're going to stay very general. And just because I see some other lawyers on the call, feel free to jump in, other lawyers. But we're going to keep it very much like big picture, high level concepts, how to succeed, how to see yourself as an artist doing contracts, how to be in business as an artist. So it's going to be pretty high level. And then if you've got a question that is like that, we'll answer it, of course.
Yeah, and just to keep specifics of names in the industry out of the chat, I think that would be great for everyone.
I haven't had that happen before, but yeah, in theory, I suppose that's possible. Yes.
Well, I might as well say it so we don't have first
it's good
of it happening. We're going to ask our attendees just do a little poll just to find out who you are. Sarah Hashem's going to put up a little poll just about who you are, where in your career, what you do, and also your level of contract literacy at the moment. So if you want to just take a second and fill that out, that'd be great. Darlene, let's jump in. So when we talked about doing this, and we talked about what contracts mean and what they really are and how they can help, and really that a good contract is a reflection of the relationship that you have with this other person that you're being contracted with. So obviously, if it's a bad relationship, it's going to be, maybe that will be reflected in the contract and vice versa. And so you said, we got to talk about the talk. So let's have the talk. What is the talk?
Well, there's a couple of things. Let's start with this. I think on the artist side, on the creator side, the assumption is the contract is what the lawyer does, right? There's sort of this sense that, okay, there's this contract and the lawyer's going to review it. Or if I can't get a lawyer, I might just sign it because the person who's asked me to sign it is just said that I have to. So what I always say is, it really is, and this was a joke at Universal. I would sit in my department and there was a guy from marketing who would always come up and he'd say, "Hey, Darlene, can you just print me out a contract?" And I would laugh, but the truth is the contract says something, and it says something about what you are doing with your career. So in this age of the internet, it is possible to learn quite a lot about contracting. It's possible to ask people, it's possible to follow people on social media and just consider it part of the job of a professional artist to understand a bit about contracts. It's not in substitution of a lawyer, but what we see in the Canadian music industry is that not every contract that you do is going to be one at the beginning of your career that you can necessarily afford to bring in a lawyer and really, do everything that way. So what I always say to clients is get empowered, learn as much as you can. I'll put some resources up at the end about books that I recommend that my clients read, just so that you understand the terminology and just don't see the contract as something that is not understandable, because there are some legally bits that we'll talk about, but it is meant to do something that you are a player in. I guess that's the starting point.
That's great. And I think you're what you said just off the top there, which is, consider your job as an artist to be informed. And I feel like we fight upstream a little bit because I think that there's been sort of an infantilization of artists in the past, and maybe, we got this, we'll take care of this, other people are doing this for you, you don't need to know. And I think, this whole series and just being an artist entrepreneur where you are a business, we're businesses, we're small businesses. If any startup would go into, okay, we've got to figure out that whole idea of educating ourselves in the business that we are actually in. So, why do I need a contract? Why does anybody need a contract?
Right. So a couple of reasons. This comes up a lot. The main reason I see in this industry, especially here in Canada, for the contract is to make sure everyone's on the same page and you have had the talk. So back to your original question. The talk is about what do we want to have as our relationship. The poll flashed up, but I don't know how to see it again, Sarah. If you can flip it up there. I just want to see who's doing what as far as the creative side here. But, so we've got so a lot of industry professionals probably on the call. And then not too many people who have not had any contract experience. Okay. All right. So when we talk about the talk as a creator, and certainly as you loop in your professionals that you're going to be working with, you are in charge of figuring out what deal you want to do. So when you're going into the studio with someone, you're collaborating with another artist, the best thing that you can do is think of it as a business relationship from the beginning, and that it's okay to have a discussion about what your contract is going to say, what the relationship is going to be like. And often, even most lawyers would acknowledge that we know that there's the way that we want to get things done at the end of the day. The contract is great, but I'm never the one to sit at a webinar like this and say, oh, well, you didn't have the discussion and now it's a big problem and you should have had the discussion, without the asterisk, which is to say, we understand that the creative process has a rhythm. And sometimes it can be very awkward to introduce business into that rhythm. However, it is worth its weight in gold to have that discussion. So I always say, have the talk. If you're collaborating with people, better to find out at the very beginning if it's going to be a difficult business relationship than later down the road. So it's so much more than just, did you get the right contract? We'll get into, what to look for, what to avoid. But the really key thing is to say, like all life, these are your collaborators. This is business. This is also friendship, often within bands and within groups. And that makes it difficult, but shouldn't be impossible. And I think, Miranda, you made a good point, which is it's scary, the contract, the business talk. So much of what makes it scary is thinking someone else knows all the answers and you don't know the answers and you don't have any ability to get a lay of the land. I think it's true that, if it's an important contract or it's governing rights, you need to have a professional. That's for sure. However, you can get really informed. And each thing that you do, you can get more and more and more informed over time so that you can work well with your advisors. That's true on the financial side and on the legal side. So most of the time when I hit real red flag issues in contracts, it's because people didn't have the talk. They thought it was someone else was doing it. We don't need to look into that. That's getting done. And then the problem happens.
Yeah, it's funny. It sort of reminds me of my family studies class in high school, where with regards to obviously not contracts, but I remember my teacher said, if you can't talk about it, you shouldn't be doing it.
Kind of, yeah. And also people if someone is really rushing you, and we'll talk about this, but I hear quite a lot that, oh, well, they said if I didn't sign it today, etc. ... Well, that's the very contract I would never sign today, unless there is some very significant, if it has to be signed today, definitely bring in a professional. If there's some sort of like strong arming happening, that is something you hear all the time. Oh, they told me this, and so I did this. Well, even an hour of, asking around or speaking to a trusted friend or asking a lawyer for, a bit of a time, anything, but don't sign that thing just blindly.
And that's an investment too. I mean, we're talking about being a business, and
Yeah.
if you've got something like that where there will be some money coming in down the road, but if this is done properly, then that seems like a reasonable investment in your career to have the advice from a lawyer to look it over and make sure that that is going to do what it says it's doing. So you've got the two things: establishing the expectations on both sides. This is what I will provide. This is what I will provide.
Yep.
This is the end result. And then also just giving you recourse at
That's
the end
right.
of the day if something goes wrong, because just like falling in love and getting married, that might not last forever. We don't know. There are lots of factors, and there's got to be a way that there will be some sort of out switch, and we'll get to some of that as well. But I want to get a couple definitions out of the way, because I think that's also important.
Okay.
So just sort of joint copyright, what that is, and what constitutes authorship. So some of those to just clarify would be great.
Okay, getting into the deep copyright. So basically, with the people on this call, we're dealing with musical compositions and sound recordings, usually as the work that's being copyrighted. And all copyrighted work is covered by the Copyright Act. So there's a statute here in Canada, there's a similar statute in the US, and we're working within the parameters as lawyers of that act. And one of the things is, a lot of what we see a lot is, without a clear understanding of what copyright is, what can carry copyright, or what copyright can attach to, we have a lot of situations that I see where, for example, people just split it 50-50. Well, split what 50-50? So one of the things to start with, even before we get to joint copyright, is that there are two copyrights in a song. So obviously, seeing the span of people on this call, this is going to be very basic for some, but I always explain it with copyright that it's sort of two legs of the jeans. So the song is a pair of jeans. You've got the composition on the left, you've got the sound recording on the right. And if you are not dealing with both legs of the jeans, you have a problem. So if you're a singer-songwriter, you've got to be thinking of yourself as both legs of your jeans, dealing with my composition, dealing with my sound recording. And then what we see a fair bit when we talk about joint copyright is people getting in a room without a plan for how they're going to separate rights. And then something I say to my clients a lot, which I would be interested if others agree with, but my experience is no one's fighting until it's a hit. Once it's a hit and there's some money flowing, then the fact that there was no contract is a problem. Then is when we start to realize we didn't have a meeting of the minds about what that creative process was going to look like. And then on top of that, you've got who wrote what? Did I write? Did I just produce? Like, what was I doing in there? So I always recommend, when you have that talk at the beginning, not just like you can have the talk, but prior to the talk, you have to know what you own and what you expect. And sometimes the best use that an entertainment lawyer can be is to tell you what's market, what's standard. So when you get in a room with people and they say, oh, we're going to split it equally, but you're the main performer and you're the main songwriter and they're just doing the production, or, who knows what the situation is. But if you don't have a strong sense of where your rights are and what your percentage should be from having had the discussion before you get in the room, you might write the big hit and it will forever have the wrong split. So it's not just about, as Miranda and I talked about, it's not just about getting that contract that has some words in it done and signed, or, okay, good, we got our paper done before we went in the studio. Like, did we have an informed view of what that paper should say? So some of the best investment maybe to make is to say, I'm a recording artist. What should I be asking for when I go into the studio? How should I be working with producers? What kind of paper do I need with my producer? I'm a songwriter. What should I be asking for? I'm going to a songwriting camp. What should I be looking for? There's a contract about the songwriting camp. What's in it? So these are the questions. And I think the other thing to say, sort of tied to that example about printing out any contract, is these contracts are specific to you. Even if it looks like it's been done a million times in the same format, it's still governing what your life, what's going to happen with your baby, your song. Miranda, you're referencing family studies. It's actually very apt because you've got the mom and the dad and the babies, which are the songs. And so there can be a lot of arguing over the songs and the splits and who did what. So that's one way to think of it as well. Very
Yeah.
contentious at times.
Yeah, and again, like you said, it's contentious, especially when there's a success. And
That's right.
then what were the contributions made?
The thing about getting your deal and having the talk in advance of getting in the room is that if you do not have the talk, you jointly own this piece of work that you've done. And where that gets complicated is that a joint owner can't act on behalf of all the other owners to do things. So if you didn't have a chat and you thought you were just going into the studio, sometimes I see, the producers invoiced you for studio time and you're like, good, it's my song. And yes, they did that little thing where they added that part and that was nice of them. They may take a claim that they wrote part of that song and that's their music and you can't use that song as produced without dealing with them somehow. So I think just the understanding, we don't have to get into it deeply, but the understanding that if you don't think about it, the problem doesn't go away. You've got to deal with it, because if you don't deal with it up front, you're going to deal with it later by way of having your ability to deal with your hit song restricted, or you paying way too much for the service that you received in the
And it can
scheme of
be
things.
tricky if for other uses, if it was licensed, if there was an interest in licensing it for film and television, then you'd have to get the permission. And then,
That's right.
yeah, right, okay. And then also just authorship. Then, so what constitutes, is that sort of the same thing, and it just figuring that out and making sure that's part of the talk?
Well, I always think in the talk, the question, the way I deal with it is I say, you're going into the studio. If you're just say you're a performer, you're going into the studio. If you're just performing, they're giving you the music, you're playing it on the recording, you set a rate for your services, or you come up with an agreement for what that's going to look like. If you are going in and they're saying, hey, Miranda, we need some violin on this, and there's no formula for what you're going to be doing, then you are writing. You are going to be coming up with music, and you need to deal with that in your deal. So, if you end up writing the bump, bump, from Sweet Caroline or whatever, that could be huge. That could be a big, big thing. And if there's nothing written to cover what you were supposed to get for that, you may just get your fee for that day. And that in some cases might be appropriate and in some cases might not be.
Yeah, that's certainly something that I've had in my career have happen as a session player. And I know that there's a great fiddle player named Steve Wickham who plays in the Waterboys, and he came up with the lick that's in Fisherman's Blues, which is a very, that sort of sets that song apart. You hear it in 2 seconds of that and you know what song it is. And they did actually work out something in the after of what that would be for him. But certainly something like that. And I think that gets us right into all the different kinds of agreements, because again, when I first started, I didn't really realize there were, band agreements. I didn't know that was a thing that could be done, and shareholder agreements similar to like a startup or in a corporation or a tech sort of environment. So maybe if you could just give us a little bit of that, some of those different agreements that are possible, and just so people are aware that they're out there and that there is a practice of being done.
Basically, the way that I work, so I did work in-house at a record label, and then we now do media, tech, and entertainment. And what I see are some parallels, which if you are someone who follows startup culture and Silicon Valley and things like that, one thing I will say about tech and sort of startup culture is that there's a much higher understanding now about dealing properly with co-founders when you start a tech company. I mean, if you've seen The Social Network about the founders of Facebook, they had issues as founders. Like, what are we going to do with this asset that we created? And it was all a big argument after the fact. Similarly, in the context of bands and artists or anyone collaborating, I mean, if you're in a band and you all sat together and came up with like the coolest band name of all time, and you just start playing and you're a band for 10 years and then you break up, like, who can use the band name? Once everyone's fighting, that's a really hard thing to discuss and to come to good terms on. If you had a band agreement, sort of similar to a shareholders agreement in the tech context, you've got a plan. So it's like, hey, if things go sideways, look, they're not going to, because we're creative partners, we're doing amazing things. But just like if things did, here's how we're going to handle it. And band agreements can cover almost, anything that you can see as an issue. But when you do a band agreement, it kind of calls into question some of the things that go in that talk. Like, okay, what are we doing? So someone leaves, how do we handle that? Right? Do they get royalties forever? Do they get royalties on just the songs that they did? Do they get a piece of the band? It's a discussion. And I am not one to say that all of that can be thought through perfectly in the beginning in every case. It's just not true. And I think often we do deal with things after the fact imperfectly, because this is a creative business. It's not a widget business, as I always say, and it's humans. So it's one of the things that makes being a music lawyer so fun, and so challenging, is that these are human relationships, and they're very difficult to boil into paper sometimes. But it's worth doing. So I would say a band agreement, anything you can do at the beginning to just treat yourselves like a business. And honestly, it's helpful on the relationship side as well, just to remember that you're dealing with your assets that could be for life. There's a lot of talk right now about, streaming royalties are not what the CDs were, and these sorts of conversations. But the interesting thing now is that if I buy a CD, or if I buy an album today, a vinyl, probably in my case, I'm going to just pay that one time. So I've paid my money, label gets the money, pays the artist the royalties. But in the streaming world, those royalties are going to come in for as long as people listen to that album, right? So it's a really long-term relationship that you're entering into as an artist these days. So there's really no way around just thinking I am a business now, and these are my business partners that I am collaborating with.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that too, just about obviously very different business from a lot of other businesses, because there is that sort of hang time, which is not necessarily in every business. But I find that having that conversation, having these tricky conversations, actually does make, strangely, the music better, because you're communicating better. And that's really all what making music is communicating with each other. And I wish I'd known that earlier, obviously. But I did see, in the musical Hamilton, they could, they obviously, Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote it, but they had a real cast of collaborators who came up with a lot of that. And that was acknowledged after the fact, where they were given a piece of that show. And I see that as being, again, like the Steve Wickham, where things are being fixed. And I think that's to your point, that it's not ever the end of the road until, I think there's always a way to sort of come back from something. But the whole point of this webinar really is to sort of, how can we spot that first and prevent that with the things that were the deals we're making.
Well, you make a great point about Hamilton. So just one other thing to say to artists, because I'm always like, the thing that lawyers think is great about artists is that you're all you have to be quite intuitive and in touch to be creative. So whenever I deal with artist clients, or often any of the creative clients this would apply to, you have good instincts, and you know how to choose collaborators, and you know when something is wrong. And I think that sometimes I see artists override those instincts because they think, oh, but they said, and I don't know anything about that, so I'll just go with what they said. If your gut is telling you that this person is not on the up and up, listen, because you cannot make good art without good instincts, in my view and my experience. And I think that so often some of the cases that we see that went sideways are really those ones where you kind of knew. And that's what makes them so frustrating as well. So sometimes you might not get the proper contract, but you might know, hey, I'm in a room with some really good, solid people. And that is demonstrated by the fact that they work with solid people, and everyone around them, use your, all the skills that you've developed to life so far. Because sometimes you are dealing with good people, and they'll say, hey, we had a hit, let's share the wealth, sometimes. And sometimes you're dealing with really terrible people. And even if you have a great contract, there's, it's not going to be how you expect either. So choose good people to work with. It's number one thing in contracts, if you can.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think I did I have a little mantra for myself, or how to choose gigs, or be able to be happy when I'm doing one, which is good money, good people, good music. And it has to be 2 out of 3, because if you've got 2 out of 3, then you're going to be happy where you are, and not feel resentful in any kind of way that you're involved in using your time that way. But I think you're totally right about Spidey sense, and kind of, I think I've definitely seen that with my colleagues and felt that myself. Just, and again, that's where a relationship is put on paper in a contract. So if it's a good relationship, you feel good, it will be a good contract, and sort of, and vice versa. I want to get into a bit of risk chat in a sec, and also negotiation. But before that, you made a point too about knowing where the money comes from and what is involved in copyright, and what's involved when you're making the deal. What are you making the deal for? And we at Music Canada and Connect did this video series that's getting released today, which is very exciting. And if you can go and understanding royalties in the digital age, so we've put the link in there, because that will also just give artists and artist entrepreneurs and business professionals a real streamlined way to see what that looks like in real time. I loved your jeans analogy. I think that's great. I can use that in the future. Darlene Tonelli.
Simplistic. A little simplistic, but I have seen so many contracts where I'm like, oh, do you write the songs? Yes. Oh, okay, this contract is only for the recording. So anyway, it's a way I started doing it, and it seems to connect. And sometimes I say you also need the right to wear the jeans, depending on the context, because there's the public performance. And anyway, it can get the simplistic jeans analogy can get complicated, but
the traveling pants. I love
the traveling pants. Yes, that's what it is.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to have that knowledge, and again, that infantilization of artists that shouldn't happen anymore. It's up to us to empower ourselves to do that, and that comes to where we're going here in negotiation, because I think that is key in these contracts. You shouldn't be put in a situation where you don't understand, or you don't know what it is, and you don't feel like you have any chips on the table. So maybe you could kind of give us a bit of do's and don'ts of contract negotiation, and also, being prepared, and what your walkaway is, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so same kind of theme on negotiation. I really believe that so many problems in our industry are tied to this idea that it is someone else is going to negotiate something, and without really, understanding that it is a collaboration between the client and the lawyer anyway. And then in the days when you're very early, which is really what this webinar is directed at. I mean, there will come a time when you have a lawyer handling every single contract, but that's not, we have to find a way to help people with information before they're at that step, because I think there's a real gap in Canada right now. And we're trying to fix it with some of the stuff that we're developing at Inter Alia. But right now, you are going to be in a position where you kind of have to negotiate. So this is a different world than we were in 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, or even 5. So every day we all click on terms of service. We all read contracts every day. That's new. That wasn't happening 20 years ago at all. So we are getting a facility around contracts that maybe we didn't have. We're talking about personal information and, agreements you enter into with Facebook when you go on their site. And, even I don't always read the terms of service when I sign up for something, because of the risk thing that Miranda was talking about. But you've got to understand that these contracts are something that you can get some basics about, and you can get some help on the difficult stuff. Then when you go to negotiate, it is a skill. It's just like a life skill. So it's something that you can get better at, and everyone gets better over time. So I did a seminar for music managers a while back, and I said, the funny thing is there was only one course in negotiation at law school, and I didn't get to take it. It was just like always full, like 30 people in it. It's ridiculous. But don't assume that lawyers learned all this stuff about negotiation at law school. We learned it on the job. We learned it from getting in there. And the way that I negotiated in the early days before I really knew my stuff was just to over prepare and learn as much as I could, and get as into the, facts, and talk to people and understand sort of what was normal and what was market. And that's such a big part of it. So when you're starting out, you're looking at, what do I need? And you really have to just think about that. And that's why we say, understand what rights you have, or what your assets are that you're contributing. And then think about, okay, why am I at the table? Like, why am I doing a record deal? Because I think there's a lot of bitterness sometimes in the industry about, oh, the label is doing this and they're not doing, and I did this. And I think there's a lack of communication between the two sides sometimes about like, what are our jobs and what's possible? Like, what can a label possibly do? And why do I go into a label deal? What are they meant to be doing? If I don't need money to make my album and I have my own funds, like maybe I don't do a record label deal. Maybe I get it as far as I can on my own before locking up my rights. All of this goes to negotiation. Because if you get into something and you're not really clear on what it is you need this other party for or what you want, it's very hard to get a good deal. So some of the time you could, for example, get some help on figuring out what to negotiate, what to ask for, what's market, what is a typical producer royalty, what should I be looking for? And some of the resources that we'll share at the end will be helpful on that front. If you don't know what you're asking for, you can't negotiate well. Very simple. And if you've done no research to understand what some of the things that you could achieve through the negotiation are, that will be very difficult. But I find that if you look at negotiation as something that you're not naturally good at, no one, an early mentor of mine said, unless you feel a bit of discomfort when you negotiate, you're just talking. It's like, that's very accurate, actually. But I've also learned throughout my career that it's also not like on TV where you're supposed to just like upend the table if you don't get what you want. And, really, that's one strategy. Certainly people use that one. My strategy has always been, look, here's the situation. We're all just people trying to get to a result. Let's do this properly and try to be respectful throughout and try to see what the other side needs, tell them what we need, build a rapport. And generally speaking, if you're in the room with people who are, people you want to be working with, that can work, So, and it depends what you're looking to do. But that's something that I think is a missing element in the Canadian music industry, is just the sense that we can take negotiation on as a skill to improve at through the course of our career.
Yeah. All of us. Better communication too, and I did watch the masterclass of Chris Voss, who is the hostage negotiator. Yeah, fascinating. Just some of those skills, which actually I would put under emotional intelligence. A lot of them, and trying to, again, to your instinct point, using some of those. I think.
And to that point, let me just say one thing. I think it's a very important point about EQ and emotional intelligence. The other thing that I have seen is so many of the contracts that I have done, when there was a problem later, if I negotiated them at the beginning and built the relationship, then we can deal with whatever problem, So you're not just negotiating the contract, kind of punching each other out across the table and like, see you later. I think that's sort of more historical. Whereas now, especially if you're doing a deal with a label, and you've got the sort of, with the major label, you would have an in-house lawyer like me on the other side. You're in a long-term relationship with these people. So if you can build it at the beginning and sort of teach people from the beginning that you're going to be professional about your career, you're going to ask good questions, respectful, and you retain management that is the same, I don't think that a good relationship with appropriate boundaries and professional, well-informed asks is ever going to hurt anybody on this call.
Yeah. And I think it's sort of like building a Lego bridge, and the bridge is only as good as both sides reaching over and trying to have that sort of strength and fortification on both sides. The other thing I think is interesting, that because you mentioned the lay of the land, like understanding why is the artist at the table? What are they bringing? What are they getting? And again, our business is sort of strange because there isn't sort of a point of entry for everybody. There's not the same little, you go to law school, you get a degree. For musicians, it's very different, and everyone has come in a different way and has a very different skill set. But I think the other point that you were talking about is knowing what you're at the table for and knowing what your skill set is, because I think artists have a vast amount of different things that they can bring. So when you're negotiating with a label, and you want to be the person who's contacting people, you want to do some legwork, you have a lot of contacts in the industry yourself as an artist, and you want to leverage those. That's a huge thing that you have. That's an asset, and you need to know what that's going to be used for if you're going to still be able to use it. You know what I mean? I feel as though we forget about about those things, about our own SWOT analysis, as if we were a tech startup, that we would be thinking about that a lot more, I think.
Well, you've made, yeah, it's a really important point, actually. And that's the other thing is if you really, if this is really Greek, like you sort of try and it's still Greek, then you do have to choose good advisors to have around you. And you've got to do the things that you're good at. So if networking is your thing, then your job in the mix is to go and ask all the other artists that you know what they're getting paid when they, perform with bands session, like where do they get their money? Like your job is to kind of, use your network, like Miranda was saying. If it really is Greek, though, and it is something that you're not comfortable with, I mean, for me, there was a time when I still do a little bit too much of my own social media, and it's not a skill. It's not something I'm good at. And it needs to, at some point, you've got to be honest with yourself and say, okay, time to get someone else to do that. That's not my best thing. And I have to invest in it because I can't do it well on my own. And that's equally as important to, if you are someone who has a bit of aptitude, great. And if you've tried a little bit and you're like, listen, this is not my thing, then yes, you've got to invest more. Same with me. There are people who do social media really well. They don't have to invest as much in it. Cool. But I will have to, so
And that goes
very
back,
good point.
that goes back to the empowerment and also just understanding, because if you've got people on your team, and I think, people always say, oh, I can't afford to have a lawyer at this point, or when do I get a manager, or when do I move to these different steps? But, yes, you want to have the investment, but you also have to think about what are those people going to bring back into your career? So if you're saving the time doing social media and you think that actually the social media person is going to get your music out to a vast, a bigger audience than you could yourself, that is a great investment. That's part of the thing. And again, I think that goes back to risk. I think we should talk a little bit about risk and the risk balancing, because that does come up what you see. That's what the contracts are really about.
Yeah, I would say the key, we marketed this as red flags to watch out for. So I would say if I were to make a small short list of red flags, number one on that list would be sign it right now. You have to do this today. Red flag. No, nothing has to be done today unless you're going to give me $5 million. I'm being extreme, but it would be, if someone's trying to strong arm me into a contract, as I said at the top, that to me is a real red flag on a number of levels, on how you treat people, on what could be in this contract, etc. Another red flag is long-term deals. So now, with the caveat that the record business is a business that is built on the structure that's, again, like the startup world, is like a venture capitalist. So a record label invests in 10 startups, and 2 of them succeed or 1. And it's this sort of bucket where the successful artists are powering the unsuccessful artists. And by success, it's like unrecouped. For whatever reason, the album didn't sell. And the thing about a record label is you get a loan and they're basically making a bet on you. They're basically saying, we're going to put this money down and make this album with you, and we're going to hope it sells, but you don't have to pay us back if it doesn't. That's why I say it's like a venture capitalist instead of a bank, right? It's not a loan. You don't have to pay it back. If you get an advance, you don't have to repay it if your album doesn't sell enough. That's kind of the bargain of the record label. So the long-term deals are often a function of that bargain. So sometimes if you want to get a recording agreement, you want to have your masters paid for, you don't have the resources to make a record, you don't have the resources to market, you think they've got a good team, they want to own the masters, that might be the right deal for you. There are some major artists in the world. I mean, U2 once did a deal where the label owned their masters, and then at some point they bought them back through some dealing. But you've got, that is the standard. I mean, you need to sometimes do these deals that aren't exactly what you would want. That's the risk that you're taking. But then if someone, doesn't have any proven track record, and they're just a brand new label, or you're unfamiliar and they're only giving you like a certain amount of money that you could maybe come up with through another way, do you do a long-term deal? Like, these are the questions you need to kind of ask yourself. So I would say a long-term is a thing that I would flag as a risk in a deal that you need to be aware of and get some advice on.
Can I just make a
And
point on that too? Because I think that that's really interesting, and I think that applies to publishing as well. And
yeah,
I'd love to
totally.
just stop on that for a second, because I think there's this historic ideas of what success looks like in this industry, maybe from before 2000. But are you signed? Are you with a label? Or do you have a publishing deal? And so I think there's been sort of a scramble to get those things, thinking that those were actually markers of success when not necessarily. And I have a friend who is a Grammy winning artist, lives in the States. He signed a publishing deal very early on in his career, had some massive, massive hits. And then even though he, selling all over the place, et cetera, he was sort of living hand to mouth with his family because he had signed that away and wasn't recouping in that place. So I think just maybe a little bit of just where the risk sits there would be great.
Well, I mean, it definitely there you can do a broad variety of deals, right? You can do a deal where you're giving up copyright in your masters and in your compositions in exchange for money now, right? That you're supposed to recoup. Then you are reliant on the other party to make sure you get paid properly for your whole life. And so you've got to have the investment there to make sure that they are doing that. That's the nature of it, right? So even in the record label world, there was a time where the labels used to ship a box of CDs to the store, and the store would be like, we sold 20, here's 10 back. And it was very clear and obvious what was happening. In the digital world, Apple says we sold this many. And then what the label has to do is go, or the publisher, they have to go audit, they have to go look and see if that's true. Same is true for an artist, or a writer. If you're going to do one of those deals, you would want to make sure that you have the rights to go back in and make sure that you're getting paid and that you're setting aside money to go back and do that. That's just part of the business. So if you kind of let someone have free reign and you never go check, then, that is a situation where you might get some bad actors. I mean, certainly the press has a number of those stories over the years. There was a recent one where one artist had just never been paid, like from the 60s, for anything that he had done, but the label had paid for him to tour all around so that he could sell more albums, and he was happy. I forget the artist's name, but it was quite something, that one. So I would say that when it comes to, doing those deals for long-term rights, just understand, like, you're giving your baby to someone and saying, you're going to go and make sure my baby makes its way in the world. And then the deal is I get paid back for you doing that. So if you don't have any recourse to make sure you're paid properly, you're just relying on the goodness or not goodness of the partner.
Mm-hmm. I think we saw that in the movie Inside Llewyn Davis as well. That was one of those components where he'd come in and written a song, and that it had become quite successful, and other people were taking that baby to Harvard.
Well, and you look too, I mean, the artist or the writer is in such an important position. I'm sure most people are familiar, well, maybe not, but in the Dolly Parton case, she wrote the song I Will Always Love You. She did well with it. It was a Billboard hit. And then Elvis and his management came to her and said, we want to perform this song. And she said, great, Elvis at the height of his fame wants to do my song. This is amazing. And Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, said, you have to give us half the song though. Like, we have to be part of the writing.
In perpetuity. Yeah.
Forever, like copyright. That's how Elvis, that's what he does when he records songs. That's our deal. And she said no to that deal. And she said that she cried and she was upset about it. And it was this whole thing. And meanwhile, Whitney Houston recorded that song again in the 90s. And like Dolly Parton says all the time now publicly, that's paying for everything that I do, like Whitney doing that song. I mean, obviously she's had her own huge career on top of that. So that's an exception.
I mean, she's such a great example because she said, songs are my babies and they're going to take care of me when I'm older.
That's
and
right.
Also take care of all of us because she sponsored vaccines. So there you go.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, that was a decision, firmly her own decision, that she knew it was right for those songs. And, I think that would have been an extraordinarily difficult decision to make at the moment. So I would say, to your point, there is often in music this big trade-off between money now and money later, or, rights that I get to keep, which are going to be money later. Maybe it's a hard one. I don't know that there's a right answer. I would never say to an artist, there's always a right way It's
Yeah.
always better to have a short-term deal. It's always better to, it's not true. It depends. If you have a good, I mean, I don't like when lawyers say it depends, but in music, it is a basket of factors. So that's why I say it's important to just kind of have your ear to the ground, get a bit of knowledge, and loop in professional advisors that you trust as early as possible in your career, and try to keep things on a like 1 year at a time basis or something with your professional advisors or with lawyers. You don't, here in Canada, you can just get advice on a billable hour basis. You don't need to go and sign a big deal with people to get advice early in your career, but just get a pipeline for some give and take, some awareness on your part, and some professional advice.
Yeah. And I think it's also knowing your own risk tolerance, because that's so
Yeah.
much about how close to the edge do you want to get, or do you feel comfortable getting, before you will give up your rights in exchange for money that you need now, or what does that look like? If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A function. I wanted to just also hit on something, because we were talking about those red flags and talking about how do we know what we should be aware of, our spidey senses, and also our eyes. But when there's no out, I think we don't want to end up in a marriage like in 1950s Ireland, where there's no divorce. That's another thing, I think, and maybe sort of speak a little bit about the out clauses, and if you don't see that, that might be a red flag.
Certainly, I mean, in a license, so there's a recording agreement, there's a license agreement where you continue to be the copyright holder, but you license them exclusively to someone for a set period of time. And then there's a distribution agreement, which is you've made the master, you do all the marketing, you do all that stuff. Is on the label side. And you just give a fee to the distributor to put your music out wherever. That could be a TuneCore when you're starting out digitally, globally, or the Orchard or something like that. And then on the publishing side, you've got everything from a full publishing agreement, co-publishing agreement, admin agreement. And an admin agreement is sort of the equivalent of the distribution deal, where you're not giving up any copyright. You're just getting someone to help you collect royalties. So even within the spectrum of deals that you can do in this industry, there are higher risk deals and lower risk deals. So there are longer term deals, there are shorter term deals. So it would be very common for a recording agreement to be very long term or forever. Perpetuity means forever in contracts. And in a license deal, you'd set a term, which would be, 5, 10 years, 2 years, whatever you decide is appropriate, and you can negotiate. Then you've got the distribution agreement, which would be standard, much shorter, 2 to 5 years with a renewal. And so one thing I would say is a red flag to watch for is a lot of deals will say this deal automatically extends until we're recouped. That's something you should watch for. I mean, it's certainly something you may not be able to negotiate around, but it's effectively saying that if you owe the label money or the publisher, you will have to, the publisher, anyway, let's say the label for now. If you owe the label money, the rights extend. The term that you've granted them will extend until you've paid them back. So there are ways to deal with that in the contract to make it so that it doesn't go on in perpetuity if you can't recoup through sales. But, effectively the deal is, in that case, we have your rights forever if your album doesn't sell enough. So a lot of the bad stories that you hear where rights are like locked up are either a recording agreement or one of those deals.
And also, I'm wondering too about performance measures, because there's got to be some checks and balances to say, is this being done what you said you're going to do? And then what's the recourse if it isn't being done? And sort of how to build that in.
Yeah, I think certainly in professional services agreements, those are appropriate. You don't see them as often in record label deals. Usually the label has more of the bargaining power stacked in its favor. So they'll do things like options where if the album doesn't sell enough, they won't make another one. If the album does sell a lot, they will have the rights to make another one. But in a professional services deal with, say, your accounting team or your manager would be a good one. You'd want to say something like, what are our goals together as a team? And for a manager, if you're an artist looking for a signing, you might say, hey, I got to have 3 meetings with labels this year, serious meetings. Otherwise, what are we doing together? or I've got to perform at 5. Like, you can make it really specific. And if those targets are hit, you extend for another year. But that's just, again, to the relationship building point, right? It's just, is this going to work? Are they motivated? Do we have the same incentives at the end of the day? That's
Yeah.
what you kind of want to strive for.
And I love that. I love that we've done this whole hour talking about contracts, but really, what we're talking about is the relationships, communication, and the building of that, and that is sort of the definition of what those careers look like and how to succeed in them, and being clear, and then again balancing risk.
Well, and the bad deals, whenever I've had someone come in with a bad deal, it was not understood what it was supposed to do. There wasn't a meeting of the minds. The someone felt strong armed, didn't want to stand up for themselves. I think I'm hoping that what attendees will take away from this is all of those things happen, and knowledge is power. And having even sat through this webinar is a form of power as a start, and hopefully can give you a couple of tips to take away and think, okay, I'm going to get myself some help. I'm going to work with some people who have my interests at heart. And I'm going to do things like watch for, where do I have the ability to control my life in this picture? Where can I get my rights back? Where can I get my, if my manager's not performing, if my accounting team is missing things, what is the remedy? Those are the things. So we spoke off the top. Contract is about, setting out the meeting of the minds, explaining what the business deal is. Often you will only learn that you don't have a meeting of the minds once you start talking about a contract. And then the other thing is, once you do have a contract, if something goes sideways, in theory, you can take it to court. Very expensive to go to court, though. So, that's not an ideal remedy, but you've got something.
Yeah, some recourse at the end of the day. This is so great, Darlene. And on that sort of empowerment note, I think I just want to draw attention again to those understanding the royalties in the digital age videos that Connect has just we've just finished, and I'm so proud of these videos. Honestly, I wish I had them 20 years ago so I could have understood all of those things. So people can find, we're going to be sending out all 3 of our webinar sessions after the fact, probably in August, and then these other videos are available to as a resource on the Connect page. And I think that's all. Thank you so much, Darlene, for your time. It's been so amazing, and thank you to Ontario Creates for the funding to do these. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Bye.